What if the very system you invested in tried to tear you down? This isn't a movie script. It's the story of a man who built an empire, only to be seen as a threat while sitting in an economy seat on his own airline. He was profiled, dismissed, and humiliated. The pilot, feeling powerful at 30,000 feet, made a call that he thought would end the problem. He couldn't have known he was calling the police on his own boss, the airline's biggest and most anonymous shareholder. What happened next is a lesson in karma so swift and so severe, it's already legendary. Julian Washington was a ghost, but a very wealthy one. In the world of tech, his name was spoken with a certain reverence, not because he courted the spotlight, he actively shunned it, but because his company, Nexus Innovations, had become the silent backbone of the digital age. Nexus didn't make the sleek phones or the flashy social media apps. It created the intricate, unsexy, but utterly essential data processing algorithms and server architecture that allowed those things to function. Julian had solved the problem of data latency a decade ago, and in doing so, had made himself a billionaire many times over. He was a man of contrasts. He could command a boardroom of grizzled engineers with quiet, unshakable authority, yet he preferred the solitude of his workshop, tinkering with vintage motorcycles. He lived in a stunning yet understated home nestled in the hills of Austin, Texas, a fortress of minimalist design and cutting-edge tech that was more sanctuary than palace. He wore bespoke suits when necessary, but his heart was in worn-in jeans and a soft cotton t-shirt. He was, by all accounts, the invisible king of a vast digital empire. This invisibility was a cultivated choice. Julian understood the power of perception, and he had seen how the world treated visible black success. It was often scrutinized, questioned, and burdened with expectations he had no interest in carrying. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be a creator. So he let his work speak for itself, and it spoke volumes while he remained a whisper. His CFO, a sharp, fiercely loyal woman named Eleanor Vance, was the public face of Nexus, a role she played with masterful precision. It was Eleanor who first brought Aero Vista Airlines to his attention. Not as a travel option. Julian flew private, a necessary concession to his schedule, but as an investment. "It's a dinosaur, Julian," she'd said, sliding a tablet across the polished concrete of his conference table. "Legacy systems, union disputes every other year, a customer service rating that's somewhere between a root canal and a tax audit." Julian scrolled through the data, his eyes scanning financial statements and market analyses. "Their stock is in the toilet." "Exactly," Eleanor replied, a glint in her eye. "But look at their assets. They own their gates at every major hub. Their fleet, while aging, is largely paid for. Their international routes are grandfathered in and irreplaceable. The bones are good, Julian. The leadership is just calcified." Julian was intrigued. He had always been drawn to fixing broken things. It's what he did with code, with engines, with systems. He saw the airline not as a failing company, but as a complex machine that was running inefficiently, a machine he could optimize. "They're hemorrhaging money on fuel inefficiency and outdated booking software," Julian murmured, already seeing the patterns. "Their logistics are a mess. They're still using a mainframe system from the 90s. "The board is a closed loop of old money and back-padding," Eleanor added. "They wouldn't know innovation if it landed on their private runway. They're ripe for a hostile takeover, but no one wants the headache." "I don't want a hostile takeover," Julian said. "I want a silent one." And so it began. Over the next 18 months, through a series of shell corporations and blind trusts meticulously constructed by Eleanor's legal team, Julian began to buy. He bought on the dips after bad earnings reports, after union threats, after FAA fines. He never bought enough at one time to trigger SEC alarms, just a steady, relentless acquisition of Aero Vista stock. He was a shark circling in the deep, unseen, unfelt, until it was too late. He became their biggest shareholder, controlling a staggering 28% of the company. The board, oblivious, attributed the market activity to hedge funds and institutional investors. The name Julian Washington was never mentioned in their meetings. To them, he didn't exist. Julian had no desire to sit on the board himself. That would make him visible. Instead, he used his voting power to install 2 new members, both seemingly independent but personally vetted by Eleanor. They were his eyes and ears, his proxies. They began to ask the right questions, to gently push for the modernization that Julian had mapped out in his private notebooks. They spoke of efficiency, of customer experience, of upgrading the technological infrastructure. The old guard was resistant, but the numbers, the terrible, bleeding numbers, forced them to listen. Slowly, infinitesimally, the great creaking ship of Aero Vista began to turn. One of the first initiatives pushed by his board members was a company-wide back-to-the-floor program. The idea was that every executive from the C-suite down should spend 1 day a quarter working on the front lines, as a gate agent, a baggage handler, or a flight attendant. It was meant to bridge the gap between the corporate tower and the reality of the customer experience. Julian, hearing about it from his proxies, was amused and intrigued. He believed in understanding a system from the ground up. He had spent weeks on the server floors of his own company, listening to the hum of the machines and the concerns of the technicians. So, he decided to participate, albeit unofficially. He wouldn't go as Julian Washington, the billionaire investor. He would go as just another passenger. He wanted to see the airline not from the detached comfort of a private jet, or the curated experience of first class, but from the back of the plane. He wanted to see the chipped paint, the overworked staff, the real unfiltered state of the company he was trying to save. He booked a round-trip ticket from Austin to San Francisco, connecting through Denver. An economy seat, 24B. A middle seat, no less. He used a generic name, paid with a standard credit card, and used a burner email address. To the Aero Vista system, he was just another face in the crowd, another data point in the vast, inefficient machine he now secretly controlled. As he packed a simple carry-on bag, he felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. It was a field trip, a reconnaissance mission into the belly of the beast he owned. He had no idea that this simple trip, this quest for unvarnished truth, was about to put him on a collision course with the very prejudices and systemic failures he was trying to dismantle. He was about to learn that you can own the system, but that doesn't mean the system will ever see you as its owner. The ghost was about to walk among his own people, and they were not going to like what they saw. The first leg of the journey, from Austin to Denver, was unremarkable in its mediocrity. The plane was an older Boeing 737, the kind with thick, slightly sticky plastic on the seatbacks and overhead bins that required a significant shove to close. The Wi-Fi was spotty, the air was stale, and the flight attendants moved with a practiced weariness. Julian, squeezed between a woman who was knitting a garishly colored scarf and a young man who fell asleep before takeoff, observed everything. He noted the inefficiency of the boarding process, a chaotic free-for-all that started late. He saw the harried gate agent snap at a family struggling with a car seat. He felt the subtle vibration in the cabin floor, a sign of aging engine mounts he knew the maintenance logs had flagged. He ordered a coffee, which was lukewarm and bitter. It was exactly the experience he had expected, subpar, forgettable, and ripe for improvement. He made mental notes, tapping discrete observations into a secure app on his phone. The layover in Denver was where the first flicker of trouble began. The flight to San Francisco was delayed, first by 30 minutes, then an hour, then indefinitely, due to a minor maintenance issue. The crowd at Gate B42 grew restless. The single gate agent, a woman with a strained smile and tired eyes, was overwhelmed, offering vague platitudes that did little to quell the rising frustration. Julian stood back, watching the dynamic. He saw how a little information could have gone a long way. A simple explanation. "We're replacing a sensor on the left wing. Safety is our priority, and we expect to be underway in approximately 75 minutes. Would have pacified most people. Instead, the vacuum of information was filled with anger and anxiety. It was a failure of communication, a core tenet of his own business philosophy. Finally, 3 hours late, they were cleared for boarding. The crush of passengers, now desperate to get on the plane, was even more chaotic than in Austin. Julian, being in boarding group 4, was one of the last to get on. By the time he reached his row, the overhead bin space was predictably full. This was a common problem, one his team was already designing an algorithm to solve through smarter boarding and carry-on policies. But for now, it was his reality. "Just find a spot anywhere you can," the flight attendant at the front, a man named Kevin, said with a dismissive wave as Julian stood in the aisle with his roller bag. Julian walked towards the back of the plane and found an empty space 2 rows behind his own. As he lifted his bag, the man in the aisle seat of that row, a burly individual in a stained polo shirt, grunted. "That's my spot," the man said, not looking up from his phone. The flight attendant said to find any available space. Julian replied politely, continuing to slide his bag in. "I'm saving it," the man insisted, his voice hardening. "My buddy's coming." Julian paused. "Sir, overhead bins are first come, first served. Your friend isn't here and all the other bins are full." The man, whose name tag on his own carry-on identified him as Bill, finally looked up and his eyes narrowed. Julian saw a flicker of something in them, annoyance mixed with a clear, ingrained prejudice. He was a tall black man in jeans and a simple jacket, and to Bill, he was not someone to be reasoned with, but someone to be put in his place. "Listen, pal," Bill said, his voice rising in volume. "I told you it's saved. Find somewhere else. Or better yet, check your bag." The confrontation, though minor, began to draw attention. The flight attendant, Kevin, bustled over. "Is there a problem here?" Kevin asked, his tone already accusatory as he looked at Julian. "I'm just trying to stow my bag in this empty space," Julian explained calmly. "This gentleman claims he's saving it." Kevin looked at Bill, who gave a "what can you do?" shrug. Then he looked back at Julian. His gaze swept over Julian's casual attire, and a decision was made. "Sir, if the man says he's saving it, you need to respect that," Kevin said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're holding up the entire plane. We need to get in the air. You'll have to check your bag." Julian felt a surge of frustration, not just at the situation, but at the lazy injustice of it. Flight attendants are responsible for managing overhead bins. You know as well as I do that saving a spot isn't a policy. I'm a passenger in boarding group 4. There should have been space. Can you please just help me find a spot so we can take off? He kept his voice even, professional. It was the same tone he used to de-escalate tense negotiations. But to Kevin, it sounded like a challenge to his authority. "Sir, I'm not going to argue with you," Kevin snapped. "Your options are to check the bag, or we can have you removed from the flight. What's it going to be?" The threat hung in the air, shockingly disproportionate to the offense. Passengers were now openly staring. Julian could feel the weight of their gazes, the quick judgments being formed. The woman from his row in Austin, the knitter, was watching with wide, fearful eyes. "This is ridiculous," Julian said, shaking his head. "There's no need for this. We're all just trying to get to San Francisco." "And you are the one preventing that," Kevin shot back. Suddenly another voice joined the fray. It was the pilot, Captain Michael Callahan. He had emerged from the cockpit, his uniform crisp, his silver hair neatly combed. He carried an air of absolute authority, the unquestioned king of this metal tube. "What's the holdup, Kevin?" Callahan asked, his sharp blue eyes surveying the scene. "This passenger," Kevin said, gesturing at Julian as if he were a piece of evidence, "is refusing to follow instructions regarding his baggage. He's being disruptive and holding up departure." Captain Callahan didn't look at Kevin. His eyes locked directly onto Julian. It was a look Julian had seen before, in different contexts from different people. It was a look of instant assessment and dismissal, a look that saw not an individual, but a stereotype, a problem. "Son," Callahan said, his voice low and firm, the word son a deliberate tool of belittlement. "My flight attendant gave you an instruction. This is my aircraft and we do things my way. We are 3 hours behind schedule, and my patience is gone. You're going to hand him that bag to be checked, and you're going to take your seat, or I will have you off this plane. Do you understand me?" The cabin was silent. Everyone was waiting for Julian's response. Julian looked at the pilot's smug, unyielding face. He looked at Kevin's triumphant sneer. He looked at Bill, who was now smirking openly, and he made a decision. He was not just a passenger, he was the owner, and this was a rot in his company that he needed to see through to its very end. "I understand you perfectly," Julian said, his voice quiet but clear. He slowly lowered his bag and held it out to Kevin. "But I assure you, you will regret this." Kevin snatched the bag with a smug grin. Callahan gave a curt nod, a satisfied general who had quashed a minor insurrection, and turned back towards the cockpit. As Julian walked the few steps back to seat 24B, he could feel the stares burning into his back. He wasn't just a man who had lost an argument. In the eyes of everyone on that plane, he was a troublemaker who had been rightfully put in his place. He slid into his middle seat, the knot in his stomach tightening. The spark had been lit. The fire was coming. The flight was a study in simmering tension. Julian sat in his seat, the passive-aggressive chill from his seatmates a palpable force. The woman with the knitting refused to make eye contact, occasionally letting out a put-upon sigh. The young man by the window had his headphones on, but Julian could see him glance over, his expression a mixture of fear and disdain. To them, and likely to everyone else who had witnessed the scene, Julian was now a problem waiting to happen, a source of potential turbulence more worrisome than any weather pattern. Julian, for his part, remained preternaturally calm. Outwardly, he was a model passenger. He stared at the seatback in front of him, his posture relaxed, his hands resting on his knees. Inwardly, however, a storm of calculations was raging. This was no longer a simple field trip. It had evolved into a live-fire stress test of his own organization, and the results were proving to be catastrophic. It wasn't just about a rude flight attendant or a territorial passenger anymore. It was about a pilot who used his authority not to ensure safety, but to enforce his own biases. It was about a culture where the immediate assumption of guilt fell upon a black man in a trivial dispute. He saw the entire sequence as a series of cascading system failures. Failure 1, logistics, inadequate overhead bin space, a direct result of poor boarding policies and a failure to invest in newer aircraft with larger bins. Failure 2, customer service training. Kevin, the flight attendant, had chosen confrontation over de-escalation at every turn. He hadn't sought to solve the problem, finding a space for the bag, but to eliminate the person he perceived as the problem. Failure 3, command responsibility. Captain Callahan had failed the ultimate test of leadership. He had entered a situation, made a snap judgment based on a subordinate's biased report, and used the full weight of his command to crush a customer complaint instead of investigating it. His "my aircraft, my way" declaration wasn't about safety. It was about ego. About an hour into the flight, Kevin came through the cabin for the beverage service. When he got to Julian's row, he served the woman on the aisle and the young man at the window with a forced smile. When he got to Julian, the smile vanished. "Anything for you?" he asked, his tone flat, clipped. "I'll have a ginger ale, please," Julian said, his voice neutral. Kevin poured the drink, his movements jerky, and handed it to Julian without a word. As he did, a small pocket of turbulence jostled the plane. It was minor, but enough to make Kevin's hand slip. A few drops of the sticky soda splashed onto Julian's jacket. "Whoops," Kevin said with an almost imperceptible smirk. He made no move to offer a napkin. "Could I get something to wipe this up?" Julian asked, still maintaining his composure. Kevin let out an exasperated sigh, as if this were the greatest imposition imaginable. He tore off a single flimsy cocktail napkin and thrust it at Julian. "Here." It was a small thing, a petty act of disrespect, but it was profoundly telling. It was a confirmation that, in Kevin's eyes, Julian was not a customer to be served, but an adversary to be tormented. Julian took the napkin and slowly blotted the spots on his jacket. He didn't say another word. He simply folded the soiled napkin and placed it in the seat back pocket. He had all the data he needed. As the plane began its initial descent into San Francisco, Captain Callahan's voice came over the intercom. It was the standard, cheerful pilot voice, announcing their arrival time and thanking them for flying Aero Vista. The hypocrisy of it was staggering. Julian knew what he had to do. He had to escalate this not for his own sake, but for the sake of every other passenger who had been or would be treated this way. He needed to see how deep the rot went. He pressed the call button. A few moments later, a different flight attendant, a woman with a more professional demeanor, appeared. "Yes, sir, can I help you?" "I'd like to speak with the captain when we land," Julian said quietly. "I need to file a formal complaint against one of his crew members, and I'd also like his name and employee number." The flight attendant looked taken aback. "I see. It's highly unusual for the captain to meet with passengers on the jet bridge. Perhaps I can give you a customer service card." "I don't want a card," Julian stated, his voice firm but low. "I want to speak with the man in charge of this flight. The incident happened in his presence and with his approval. Please relay the message." The flight attendant, seeing the unyielding look in his eyes, nodded nervously and retreated to the front of the cabin. Julian watched as she spoke quietly with Kevin, who shot a venomous glare back down the aisle. Then she slipped into the cockpit. The fastened seatbelt sign dinged on. The plane made its final turn. The flaps groaned, and soon they were on the ground, taxiing towards the terminal. Julian felt a strange sense of calm. He was no longer a passive observer. He was now an active agent in this drama. As the plane pulled up to the gate and the engines spooled down, the usual flurry of activity began. People unbuckling, grabbing bags, crowding the aisle. But Julian remained seated. He watched the cockpit door. It opened and Captain Callahan emerged. He was not looking for Julian. His face was a mask of grim determination. He strode to the front of the plane and took the intercom phone. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed through the cabin, no longer cheerful but cold and hard as steel. "If I could have your attention for just one moment, due to a security concern regarding a disruptive passenger, I must ask that you all remain in your seats until law enforcement arrives to board the aircraft. Please remain seated." A wave of murmurs and gasps swept through the cabin. People exchanged nervous, frightened glances. And then, almost as one, their eyes turned to Julian. He was the disruptive passenger, the security concern. The woman who had been knitting her scarf shrank away from him, pulling her bag closer. The young man by the window looked pale. In an instant, Captain Callahan had transformed Julian from a perceived troublemaker into a potential threat in the minds of over 100 people. It was a stunning abuse of power, a public branding intended to humiliate and intimidate. Julian felt a cold fury wash over him, but his expression remained impassive. He had wanted to see how deep the rot went. He hadn't realized it went all the way to the bottom. Captain Callahan stood by the door, arms crossed, a sentinel guarding his kingdom against the peasant he had decided to make an example of. He caught Julian's eye from across the cabin and gave him a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. The pilot had made his move. He had escalated a complaint about a spilled drink and a stowed bag into a federal security incident. He thought he was ending the problem. He had no idea he had just ended his career. Julian sat perfectly still, waiting for the police to arrive. The curtain was about to rise on the final act. The wait felt both interminably long and strangely compressed. The air in the cabin grew thick with suspicion and nervous whispers. Every eye was on Julian. He was no longer a person. He was a spectacle, a real-life drama playing out for the bored and anxious passengers. He could hear snippets of conversation from the rows around him. What did he do? I knew he was trouble. So scary these days. He was being tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, with Captain Callahan as the judge, jury, and executioner. Julian ignored them all. He focused his attention on the mechanics of the situation. He analyzed the pilot's strategy. By framing it as a security concern, Callahan had insulated himself. He was no longer a manager dealing with a customer complaint. He was a captain taking decisive action to protect his flight. He had weaponized FAA regulations and post-9/11 paranoia against a passenger who had dared to question him. It was a cowardly yet chillingly effective maneuver. Finally, 2 uniformed San Francisco Police Department officers appeared at the open door of the aircraft. They were professional, their faces impassive as they conferred briefly with Captain Callahan. The pilot gestured down the aisle, pointing directly at Julian. There was no ambiguity. The officers started down the aisle, their presence silencing the last of the whispers. Their belts, laden with gear, brushed against the armrests as they moved. The passengers leaned away, clearing a path. The 2 officers, a man and a woman, stopped at row 24. "Sir," the male officer said, his voice polite but firm. "I'm Officer Miller. My partner and I need you to gather your belongings and come with us." Julian looked up at them calmly. "Am I being arrested?" "No, sir," Officer Miller replied. "The captain of this aircraft has identified you as a disruptive passenger and has requested you be removed. We're here to escort you off the plane. We just want to hear what happened." "I would be happy to tell you what happened," Julian said. He stood up slowly, deliberately. He didn't reach for the overhead bin. His bag had been checked after all. He simply stood in the aisle. "After you." The officers positioned themselves in front of and behind him, a formal escort. The walk to the front of the plane was a gauntlet of stairs. Julian kept his head held high, his gaze fixed on the open doorway. He passed Kevin, the flight attendant, who stood near the galley, arms crossed, a smug, vindictive smile plastered on his face. He passed Captain Callahan, who stood ramrod straight, the very picture of authority vindicated. The pilot gave Julian a final dismissive glare. It was the look of a man who had won. As Julian stepped onto the jet bridge, he was met not just by the 2 officers, but by an Aero Vista ground supervisor, a man in a navy blue suit whose name tag read Daniel Riley. Riley looked harried and stressed, clearly unhappy about having to deal with police on one of his gates. "Captain Callahan," Riley said, addressing the pilot who had followed them out. "What's the situation?" "The situation," Callahan announced, his voice projecting for the benefit of the officers, "is that this passenger was argumentative and insubordinate from the moment he stepped on board. He refused to follow crew instructions, became confrontational, and created an atmosphere of intimidation. When he was informed that I would not be entertaining his frivolous complaints, he became agitated. For the safety and security of my crew and passengers, I made the decision to have him removed. It was a masterful piece of fiction, delivered with utter conviction." Officer Miller turned to Julian. "Sir, is that what happened?" Julian took a deep breath. The moment had arrived. He ignored the question for a second and looked directly at Daniel Riley, the ground supervisor. "Mr. Riley," Julian began, his voice dropping to a low conversational tone that cut through the tension. "What's the current market capitalization of Aero Vista Airlines?" Riley blinked, completely thrown by the question. What? I have no idea. What does that have to do with anything?" "Let's say, for the sake of argument, it's around $4 billion, Julian continued, his voice as smooth as silk. "And what percentage of the company do you think the largest single shareholder owns?" Captain Callahan scoffed. "What is this nonsense? Officer, this is what I was talking about. He's delusional." Julian held up a hand, not to the pilot, but to Riley. "Mr. Riley, I need you to do 2 things for me right now. First, I need you to get the CEO of this airline, Mr. David Corrigan, on the phone. Not his assistant, not his chief of staff. I need David on the phone personally. Tell him you have a code Sierra on your hands." Riley stared, bewildered. "A code Sierra? That's not a real airline code." "Oh, it's real," Julian said, a faint smile touching his lips. "It's just not one you're privy to. It's a code I established with Mr. Corrigan 2 months ago for an inescapable 5-alarm emergency that requires his immediate personal attention. I assure you he will know what it means." A flicker of doubt crossed Riley's face. The sheer, unshakable confidence in Julian's voice was beginning to erode the pilot's narrative. "Second," Julian continued, pulling out his phone, "I'm going to make a call. While I'm on the phone, I want you to look at the alert that is about to pop up on your company-issued tablet." He turned away slightly and dialed a single number. "Eleanor, it's me. It's time. Execute the Washington Protocol. Full transparency." He listened for a moment. "Yes, all of them. The board, legal, and Corrigan's office. Right now." He hung up. The two police officers exchanged a confused look. Captain Callahan rolled his eyes, a portrait of exasperation. "This is a circus, Daniel. Are you really going to let this man waste our time with these games?" But Daniel Riley wasn't listening to the pilot. He was staring at his tablet, which he had instinctively pulled from his jacket. His eyes went wide. His face, already pale, lost all its remaining color. His jaw went slack. He looked from the tablet to Julian and back to the tablet, his hand starting to tremble. "Oh my God," Riley whispered, the words catching in his throat. "What is it?" Officer Miller asked, sensing the dramatic shift in the atmosphere. Riley looked up at Julian, his expression a mixture of sheer terror and awe. It can't be." He turned the tablet so the police officers and a stunned Captain Callahan could see the screen. It was an emergency alert from the Aero Vista Corporate Security and Investor Relations Division. At the top was a picture of Julian. Not a candid shot, but his official Nexus Innovations corporate headshot. Below it was a block of text. "Urgent security and leadership alert passenger, John Smith, alias. True identity, Julian Washington, founder and CEO, Nexus Innovations. Status, largest single shareholder of Aero Vista Holdings, Inc., 28.3% ownership. Action. All personnel are to extend Mr. Washington every possible courtesy and assistance. Escalate any and all requests to the CEO's office immediately. This is not a drill." The jet bridge was suddenly as silent as a tomb. The two officers stared at the tablet, then at the man in the simple jacket they had just escorted off a plane like a common criminal. Kevin, the flight attendant who had poked his head out to watch the show, looked like he had seen a ghost. His smug smile had dissolved into a mask of pure, abject horror. And Captain Michael Callahan. His face was a spectacular canvas of collapsing reality. The smugness, the authority, the righteous indignation. It all crumbled away in an instant, replaced by a ghastly, dawning comprehension. The blood drained from his face. He looked at Julian, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a problem, but as the man who held his career, his pension, and his entire future in the palm of his hand. Julian put his phone back in his pocket. He looked at the wreckage of four people's composure and addressed the pilot directly, his voice devoid of anger, holding only the cold, hard weight of finality. "Captain Callahan," he said, "you were right. It is your aircraft, or rather it was." The silence on the jet bridge stretched for a full 10 seconds, a thick, suffocating blanket of disbelief and horror. The only sound was the distant hum of the airport and the frantic thumping of several hearts. Daniel Riley, the ground supervisor, looked as if he might faint. He was clutching his tablet like a life raft in a hurricane. It was Officer Miller who broke the spell. He cleared his throat, his professionalism kicking back in, though his eyes were still wide with astonishment. "Well, this certainly changes things. Mr. Washington, our apologies. We were just responding to the captain's request." "You were doing your job, officer," Julian said, his tone gracious. "I have no issue with you or your partner." He then turned his gaze, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, back to Captain Callahan. Callahan was frozen, his mouth slightly agape. The color had not returned to his face. If anything, he was a more profound shade of pale, a sickly, chalky white. The entire edifice of his authority, built over a 30-year career, had been demolished in a single moment by a single screen. He was no longer the king of his metal tube. He was just a man who had made a catastrophic, career-ending mistake. "You," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that was more terrifying than any shout. "And you." He flicked his eyes over to the galley door, where Kevin, the flight attendant, was trying and failing to shrink back into the shadows. "Stay right where you are." His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. The caller ID read David Corrigan. He answered, putting it on speaker for everyone to hear. Julian, my God, is that you? What in the hell is happening in San Francisco?" The voice of Aero Vista's CEO was frantic, laced with pure, unadulterated panic. "Hello, David," Julian replied, his voice unnervingly calm. "I decided to take advantage of your back-to-the-floor program. I wanted to get a real sense of the customer experience, and I have to say, it has been incredibly illuminating." "Julian, I am so sorry. I just got the alert. I'm looking at the incident report now. It's unbelievable. Whatever you need, whatever you want, it's yours." "What I want, David," Julian said, his eyes never leaving Captain Callahan's face, "is for you to listen. I'm on the jet bridge at Gate B-42. I'm here with 2 SFPD officers, your ground supervisor, Mr. Riley, your Captain Callahan, and one of your flight attendants, a man named Kevin. They've all just played a role in my removal from the aircraft." There was a sputtering sound on the other end of the line. "Removal? Captain Callahan reported a security threat." "Yes, he did," Julian confirmed. "His security threat was me asking for his name to file a complaint about his crew's unprofessionalism and his own dereliction of duty. His response was to call the police on a shareholder. On the shareholder. How does that sit with you, David?" "It's a goddamn nightmare, Julian. A nightmare. Callahan is a senior pilot, 30 years with us. I don't understand." "Oh, I think I understand perfectly," Julian cut in. He saw a black man in economy who wouldn't be intimidated, and he decided to use his authority to crush him. He didn't see a customer. He saw a problem to be disposed of. This isn't a misunderstanding, David. This is a symptom of a deep systemic sickness in your company's culture. Captain Callahan finally found his voice, though it was a weak, reedy thing. "Mr. Washington, sir, I had no idea. It was a judgment call. The passenger—" He stopped himself, realizing the absurdity of using that word now. You were being—" "I was being what, Captain?" Julian challenged, turning his full attention to him. "Disruptive? For trying to stow my bag in an empty bin that your crew failed to manage? For asking for a napkin when your flight attendant deliberately spilled a drink on me? For having the audacity to request your name?" Kevin, the flight attendant, chose that moment to make a fatal error in judgment. He stepped forward, wringing his hands, his face a mess of fake sincerity. "Sir, it was a misunderstanding. The turbulence, I would never—" "Save it," Julian snapped, and the force of the 2 words made Kevin flinch as if struck. "I saw your smirk. I felt your contempt. You enjoyed every second of it." Julian turned his attention back to the phone. "David, here's what's going to happen. Effective immediately, Captain Callahan and flight attendant Kevin are suspended, pending their termination. I want their company credentials revoked before I leave this jet bridge. Their final paychecks can be mailed to them." "Done," Corrigan said instantly. There was no hesitation. Callahan staggered back a step, his hand going to the wall for support. 30 years of service, his pension, his pride, all gone, evaporated in the space of a phone call. His face, which had been a mask of authority moments before, was now just the face of a broken old man. "Furthermore, David," Julian continued, "I want Daniel Riley here to be my personal escort. He's going to retrieve my checked bag from wherever your employee threw it. Then he's going to escort me to the Aero Vista first-class lounge, where I will be meeting with my legal team, which is flying in from Austin as we speak. You will arrange for a private jet to be fueled and ready to take me, my team, and Mr. Riley back to Austin tonight." "Of course, Julian. Consider it done. The jet will be ready." "And David," Julian added, his voice dropping again, "cancel my return ticket. I have no intention of ever flying commercial on one of your aircraft again, until I am satisfied that the man shining my shoes in the lounge won't have me arrested if I scuff them by accident." He hung up. The finality of it was absolute. The reckoning had been swift, brutal, and utterly comprehensive. Julian looked at the two police officers. "Officers, thank you for your time. As you can see, the situation is resolved." "Yes, sir," Officer Miller said, still looking slightly dazed. "We'll be on our way." They tipped their hats and retreated, no doubt with a story they would be telling for the rest of their careers. Now only the Aero Vista employees remained, trapped in the tableau of their own making. Daniel Riley stood ready, his expression now one of terrified eagerness to please. Kevin was openly weeping, his shoulders shaking, and Captain Callahan was staring into the abyss. He looked at Julian, his eyes pleading. "Mr. Washington, please. My whole life, my family, a mistake. It was just a stupid mistake." Julian regarded him for a long moment, not with anger, but with a profound and weary disappointment. "No, Captain," Julian said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "It wasn't a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to lower the landing gear. A mistake is taking a wrong turn while taxiing. What you did was a choice. You made a choice based on what you saw, and you didn't see a man. You saw a stereotype. You didn't de-escalate, you dominated. You didn't lead, you bullied. And when you were challenged, you tried to ruin my life, just to prove a point. The only thing you didn't account for was that I owned the airline. This isn't karma, Captain. This is a consequence. This is the bill for your prejudice, and it has just come due." He then turned to the terrified ground supervisor. "Mr. Riley, my bag." Riley nodded numbly and practically ran towards the terminal, eager to escape the carnage. Julian gave one last look at the weeping flight attendant and the hollowed-out captain. He didn't feel triumph, only a deep, draining sadness. He hadn't wanted this confrontation, but it had found him, and now he would see it through to the end. The public reckoning was over. The private one was just beginning. The news of the incident at SFO spread through the corporate infrastructure of Aero Vista Airlines like a shockwave. It bypassed the usual channels of gossip and rumor, arriving instead as a series of high-priority encrypted directives from the CEO's office. By the time Julian Washington was settling into the plushest armchair in the SFO first-class lounge, a glass of sparkling water in hand, his checked bag retrieved and respectfully placed at his feet by a trembling Daniel Riley, the entire executive leadership of the airline was in full-blown crisis mode. The firings of Captain Michael Callahan and flight attendant Kevin were processed with ruthless, unprecedented speed. Their access to company servers and email was revoked before Julian's private jet was even fully fueled. The official reason listed in the internal memo was gross violation of company conduct and ethics policies. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. A pilot had tried to play God, only to find out he'd picked a fight with the actual deity of his particular universe. Callahan's fall was especially brutal. A 30-year veteran, he was just 2 years from a lucrative retirement. He was a pilot's pilot, a man who commanded respect and a fair amount of fear in the ranks. He owned a home in a gated community in Marin County and was a prominent member of his local yacht club. In a single afternoon, that was all gone. His termination for cause likely voided significant portions of his pension. His reputation was instantly and irrevocably shattered. The story, in its vague but terrifying outlines, was already leaking among the pilot union forums. Callahan had messed with the wrong passenger on a biblical scale. For Julian, the next few hours were a blur of calculated strategic action. His legal team, 3 of the sharpest corporate lawyers in the country, arrived looking grim and determined. They huddled with Julian and Daniel Riley, who, under direct orders from the CEO, recounted every detail of the incident, from the initial boarding chaos in Denver to the final horrifying revelation on the jet bridge. Riley, knowing his own career hung by a thread, was meticulously, painfully honest. By the time Julian's Gulfstream G650 was lifting off from a private runway, soaring over the bay and banking east towards Texas, a plan was in motion. This would not be swept under the rug. Julian had no interest in a quiet settlement or a simple apology. He had seen the sickness in his company up close, and he was now determined to be the surgeon who cut it out. The story, inevitably, broke to the public. An anonymous passenger on Flight 1128, armed with a cell phone video of the police escort and a very juicy story, had contacted a prominent aviation blogger. The initial story was sensational. Aero Vista pilot calls cops on unruly passenger. But then Eleanor Vance, acting on Julian's instructions, did something unprecedented. She confirmed the story, and she added the crucial, explosive context. Nexus Innovations released a statement on behalf of its CEO, Julian Washington. It was calm, factual, and devastating. It detailed the incident not as an emotional grievance, but as a case study in systemic operational and cultural failures at Aero Vista Airlines. It confirmed Julian's identity and his status as the primary shareholder. The statement concluded, Mr. Washington believes that this unfortunate incident provides a unique and necessary opportunity for fundamental reform at the airline. He intends to use his position as a controlling shareholder to ensure that the experience of every passenger, regardless of their appearance, their attire, or the class of their ticket, is one of safety, respect, and dignity. The media firestorm was immediate and intense. Aero Vista's stock, already fragile, plummeted. CEO David Corrigan was forced to make a public statement, a humiliating apologetic address in which he promised a top-to-bottom review of all policies and procedures. The story was perfect for the 24-hour news cycle. It had race, power, injustice, and a satisfying karmic twist. Julian Washington, the ghost, was suddenly very, very visible. And he used that visibility. He didn't go on talk shows or give interviews. He worked. From his command center in Austin, he directed a corporate overhaul the likes of which the aviation industry had never seen. First, he forced the resignation of 3 of the most entrenched old guard members of the Aero Vista board, the ones who had resisted his proxy's calls for modernization. He replaced them with experts in logistics, technology, and, most importantly, corporate ethics and diversity. Second, he greenlit a multi-billion-dollar investment package. It included accelerating the retirement of the older 737S, retrofitting cabins with larger overhead bins, and, most critically, completely scrapping the ancient mainframe system in favor of a new, custom-built logistics and booking platform designed by Nexus Innovations. His company would fix the airline's technological spine, and Aero Vista would pay handsomely for it, a move of brilliant circular capitalism. Third, and most profoundly, he tackled the culture. He commissioned a mandatory company-wide retraining program designed by leading sociologists and HR experts. It wasn't the typical check-the-box sensitivity training. It was an intense, immersive program focused on de-escalation, implicit bias, and customer-centric problem-solving. Pilots were retrained to see themselves not as absolute monarchs, but as the ultimate guarantors of service and safety for everyone on board. Flight attendants were retrained to be problem solvers, not enforcers. Gate agents were given more autonomy and better technology to communicate with passengers. The Back to the Floor program was expanded and made a permanent, graded part of every executive's performance review. David Corrigan himself was photographed 6 months later, loading baggage onto a flight to Omaha. Daniel Riley, the ground supervisor from SFO, was not fired. In a surprising move, Julian had him promoted. He was put in charge of a new national customer experience task force, his harrowing day on the jet bridge having given him a unique and unforgettable perspective on what happens when things go wrong. The changes were painful, expensive, and met with resistance from some corners of the company, particularly the more traditionalist elements of the pilots' union. But Julian was relentless. He had the power, the capital, and now, the moral authority. The story of Flight 1128 became a legend within the company, a cautionary tale of what could happen if you judged a passenger by their appearance. A year later, Aero Vista was a different airline. It was more efficient. Its customer satisfaction scores were climbing, and its stock had not only recovered but had surpassed its previous highs. The airline was even featured in business journals as a model for corporate turnarounds. Julian Washington remained the silent owner, the ghost in the machine. He never took a public victory lap. He went back to his quiet life of innovation and invention, his brief, explosive entry into the public eye, fading back into the privacy he cherished. He had fixed the broken system. He had encountered the ugliest parts of its culture head-on, and had, through sheer force of will and capital, bent it into a new shape. He had proven that one man couldn't change the world, perhaps, but if he owned 28% of it, he could certainly change an airline. And in doing so, he sent a clear, powerful message. Be careful who you anger. You never know who they might be. That is the incredible story of how a routine flight turned into a career-ending disaster for one pilot and a revolution for an entire airline. It's a stark reminder that power and authority are fragile, and prejudice carries a price that can be astronomical. Julian Washington didn't just get mad, he got even, not through petty revenge, but by forcing the system to fundamentally change. What do you think? Was this karma, justice, or just good business? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more true stories of high-stakes drama and incredible real-life consequences.